The dinner had begun at 8, and by 9 the candles had guttered low enough to soften the room into something almost kind. Almost. Lady Morpeth's dining table seated 30 when the occasion demanded it, and tonight it demanded all 30, a configuration of jewels and precedence and measured social calculation that stretched the length of the room in 2 long opposing rows. The Marquis of Stanhope occupied his customary position to Arabella's right. Lord Morpeth anchored the far end, and at the table's center, in the chair of honor that Lady Morpeth had assigned with such careful intention, sat Edward Cavendish, the Duke of Ashwick, and his face carried the particular stillness of a man who has learned to be entirely present in a room without yielding anything to it. Miss Emmeline Vane sat at his right, as the evening's geometry required. She was 19 and newly presented, and the candlelight fell through her pale curls, as though it had been arranged expressly for that purpose. She laughed at something Lord Fenton said. The Duke did not laugh with her. Cecily Hartwell sat below the salt, not literally. This was not a medieval hall, and Arabella would not have borne the censure of so obvious a slight to her own blood. The placement carried its meaning all the same. Third chair from the foot of the table, between old Colonel Painswick, who had grown quite deaf, and Mrs. Trelawney, whose attention was fixed entirely on the ragout. Cecily had learned, across 3 seasons and 30 dinners very much like this one, not to expect conversation. She wore the ivory gown she had altered twice, and the candles did their kindest work on her, and no one who looked would have said she was anything other than a sensible, quiet, unmarried woman of 26 who had no expectations and knew it. Lady Honoria Belgrave leaned across the table's corner to say something to her neighbor, a Mrs. Caldwell who collected gossip the way other women collected calling cards. "Lord Morpeth's family, yes," Lady Honoria murmured, behind the shield of her fan. "The Hartwell spinster. Arabella was the beauty, of course. Dorothea had the fortune. This one." A small pause, precisely weighted. "Well?" She reads. Mrs. Caldwell's gaze drifted toward Cecily, the way one's gaze drifts toward an object on a shelf that one has no intention of purchasing. Cecily heard it. She always heard it. She kept her eyes on her plate and ate the ragout, and did not allow the flush she felt in her throat to reach her face. She had practiced this art since the first season, when the surprise of being dismissed had still registered. The surprise was long gone. What remained was a kind of patient, very private grief, like a bruise pressed in the same place so many times that the flesh had ceased to protest and simply held the mark. When she finally looked up, because one must eventually look up, because the table required it, because Arabella was watching her with that expression, that meant she ought to contribute something, she found, for one unaccountable moment, that the Duke of Ashwick was looking at her from the far side of the table, not in passing, not as one glances across a room and happens to catch another eye. He was looking at her with a quality of attention so specific and held that Cecily felt it as a physical thing, a warmth along her collarbone she could not account for. His face gave nothing away. He had been watching. She looked down again. The dinner continued, as dinners continued. She did not understand it. She told herself there was nothing to understand. She was wrong. The Hartwell family had not always been housed on the charity of Lord Morpeth's London establishment. There had been a time, not so distant as to seem historical, when Sir George Hartwell kept a modest but respectable house in Wiltshire, rode his own acres, and paid his own bills, and sat in his study on quiet evenings with his youngest daughter beside him, and a book of botanical illustrations open between them on the table. The book was Cecily's now. It lived at the bottom of her traveling case, its binding soft with use, its margins filled with her father's small, precise penciled notes. She had not been able to leave it. Sir George died in November of 1814, 2 months after Dorothea's wedding and 14 months after Arabella's. He went quietly, as he had done everything, in the early morning before the house was awake, with the curtains still drawn against the cold. The entail passed the estate to a distant cousin named Sir Reginald Hartwell, who had never set foot in Wiltshire and promptly leased the land to a sheep farmer. The house itself was let furnished. Cecily had been permitted to take her clothes, her books, and the botanical volume, and had arrived on Arabella's doorstep in London with a trunk and a composure she would maintain, she had decided, for as long as composure was required of her. That had been 18 months ago. Arabella had been generous, in the particular way of a woman who is married well and retains the manners of the life she came from. She had installed Cecily in a pretty room and introduced her at the season's events, and accepted, without saying so explicitly, that the marriage of a third Hartwell daughter with no portion and no property was unlikely. She had begun to speak of Cecily's situation the way one speaks of a perennial garden that simply does not bloom, fondly, somewhat resignedly, with no expectation of remedy. Dorothea, now Lady Stanhope, had written from her husband's estate in Yorkshire to say that Cecily was welcome to visit whenever the season became too wearing, which Cecily translated correctly as an offer made without expectation of acceptance. The season had always been wearing. 3 seasons of it. She had watched 2 rounds of presentation and 2 rounds of the marriage market cycle through its machinery around her, and she had come to understand the machine with the clarity of someone who stands outside it. The machine required beauty or fortune, or both. Arabella had brought beauty. Dorothea had brought the small legacy of a great-aunt. Cecily had brought neither, only an education that was considered excessive for her station and a habit of reading that Lady Honoria had accurately, if unkindly, summarized at that dining table. She reads. She did read. She read to stave off the particular loneliness of a household in which she was welcome but not necessary, and she had discovered, through the accident of Thomas, that reading aloud was better still. Thomas was 7 years old, the orphaned son of Captain William Haverstock, who had served with the Duke of Ashwick in the Peninsula and died of fever in the autumn of 1812. The Duke had assumed responsibility for the boy without explanation or ceremony, and had brought him to London for the season, and had installed him in a room on the upper floor of the Morpeth House in the capacity of a guest who was never quite certain he was a guest, since no one had used that word. Lord Morpeth had mentioned to Arabella that the arrangement was temporary. Arabella had mentioned to Cecily that someone ought to sit with the child. Cecily, who had nothing else to do in the mornings, and who had liked the look of Thomas at once, had sat with him. On a Thursday morning in early May, with the light coming thin and yellow through the library windows, she was reading to him from a natural history of England when the door opened and the Duke of Ashwick walked in. She had not known he was in the house. She had not heard his arrival. She felt the quality of the silence change before she heard anything. A stillness settled at the edge of the room. And then she looked up, and he was standing in the doorway with his hand still on the latch. Thomas said, "Miss Hartwell is reading me about the common swift. It flies all the way to Africa." The Duke's gaze moved from Thomas to Cecily, and remained there. She had risen when he entered, as propriety required, and she stood now with the natural history open in her hands, and was aware, distantly and inconveniently, that her pulse had done something it had no business doing. "Miss Hartwell," he said. "Your Grace," she said. "I did not hear your arrival. I apologize for occupying the library. I will, of course." "Sit down," he said. She sat. He crossed the room and took the chair at the table's head, which put him 3 feet from where Thomas was perched on the footstool, and said, "What does the swift do in Africa?" Thomas considered. Flies, mostly. Miss Hartwell says it almost never lands. A convenient animal, the Duke said, and something in his face shifted, very briefly, before the stillness returned. She watched that shift. She was close enough to the candlelight. There was a candle lit despite the morning. The library ran dark. To see the small rearrangement of his jaw. The faint thing that was not quite sorrow, but neighbored it. She looked at her book before he could catch her looking. "Read," he said. She read. Thomas listened. The Duke sat in the chair at the head of the table, and his eyes were on the window. And once, twice, and once again, Cecily felt his attention move across the page and rest on her face with that same quality of specific, inexplicable care. The swift flew north as spring arrived. The common swift nested in old stone buildings. The common swift returned every year to the same pair of hands. She kept her voice even. She was very practiced at keeping her voice even. When the chapter ended, Thomas asked for another, and the Duke said, "One more." Not to Thomas, to Cecily. She began the next chapter with the morning rain beginning against the windows and the Duke's stillness like a river stone in her peripheral vision, steady and cold and apparently permanent, and she had no name for what she felt except that she could not quite draw a full breath, and the room had the quality of a thing held just before it falls. If only he had spoken, or not spoken. Done something that could be read. He left when the rain stopped, without ceremony, a nod to Thomas and a bow to Cecily that was precisely correct and entirely unreadable. Thomas watched the door close. "He comes to check," he said. "I beg your pardon?" "He comes to check that I am well. He does not say so." Thomas returned to his footstool with the equanimity of a child who has made his peace with a complicated guardian. He is like that. Cecily looked at the closed door for a moment longer than she should have. The weeks that followed were not simple weeks to make sense of, and Cecily had always prided herself on making sense of things. The Duke came to the library on 6 subsequent mornings, though never with any announced intention, and never at a consistent hour. He came when Thomas was there, and he came once when Thomas was not. And on that occasion he had found Cecily alone at the writing desk with the botanical volume open before her, comparing one of her father's pressed specimens against the printed plate. He had looked at the book for a moment with that quality of arrested attention he sometimes applied to her, and said, "That is a viola." And she had said, "My father thought it might be a variety of the common dog violet, but the stem is somewhat longer," and they had spent 20 minutes discussing the length of the stem, which was not a subject either of them had any urgent reason to discuss, and Cecily had felt afterwards that something had shifted, though she could not have said what, and told herself firmly that it had not. Lady Honoria had begun, by this point, to take notice of the library visits. She called on Arabella one afternoon with Miss Vane and 2 of the season's other notable diamonds, and sat in the drawing-room with her fan employed at a precision that Cecily had come to understand as a social instrument. Lady Honoria Belgrave was 62 years old and had lived her entire life inside the machinery of the ton with the confidence of a woman who built the machinery herself. She was not unkind in the manner of someone who takes pleasure in cruelty. She was unkind in the manner of someone who has simply never considered that the order of things might be wrong. "Ashwick has been spending time above," she said to Arabella, with a tilt of her head toward the upper floors. "With the boy." "He is fond of Thomas," Arabella said carefully. "He ought to be. He has assumed the responsibility." Lady Honoria's fan moved. "I understand your sister has been reading to the child." Arabella said, "Cecily is very good with him." "I am sure she is very useful." A pause, brief and surgical. "She always struck me as a useful sort of woman. The Hartwell Spinster. No portion, no prospects, but steady. One is grateful for steady women when one has inconvenient dependents. Cecily was in the doorway, having come down to return a book to the drawing-room shelf. She heard the words clearly. She stood for one moment in the threshold, and then she stepped back into the corridor and went upstairs again. Useful. A useful sort of woman. She sat on the edge of her bed with her hands folded in her lap, and she did not allow herself the luxury of tears, which would have served nothing and convinced no one. And after a few minutes, she got up and washed her face and went back to the writing table and wrote a letter to Sir Reginald Hartwell, inquiring with careful dignity whether there was a position in the management of his Wiltshire estate that might suit a woman of moderate education and steady habits. She did not expect a reply for some time. She told herself the letter was a precaution. If any of you have been told, as Cecily had been told, that you were the one who could be left to manage, I think you will know what it cost her to write that letter. Leave a word below, if you like. She kept writing. The Duke's visit 2 days later was not to the library. He found her in the morning room, which she had the use of in the afternoons, since no one else wanted it in the afternoons, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand. And she rose, because one always rose. And he said, "Thomas has asked me to thank you for the Swift." "The Swift," she repeated. "He has been drawing them. He drew 9 of them on the back of my correspondence yesterday afternoon." A pause. She felt the corner of her mouth move before she could prevent it. "I am sorry," she said, "about your correspondence." He looked at her with that quality of attention she had stopped trying to account for. "Do not be," he said. It was tedious correspondence. He did not sit. He stood in the doorway of the morning room with his hat and his stillness. And after a moment he said, "You read with precision. Most people read to children as though the child is less intelligent than they are." It was, she thought, the most deliberate thing anyone had said to her in years. Not a compliment so much as an observation. As though he had simply noted a fact that deserved to be named. "My father read to me that way," she said. He thought precision was a form of respect. Something moved behind his eyes. Gone before she could read it. He said, "What was his name?" "Sir George Hartwell. He died the autumn before last." "I am sorry," he said with a gravity that was not the ceremonial gravity of social condolence, but something quieter, the grief of a person who had also lost someone and knew the particular weight of it. She thanked him. He left. She sat back down in the morning room chair with the letter half written on the desk before her, and her hands in her lap, and the specific ache of someone who has been very precisely seen and does not know what to do with the evidence of it. What she did not yet know was what the portrait in the Ashwick Hall study looked like. She did not know that it was turned to face the wall. She did not know that it had been hanging there, face outward, for 2 years and 8 months after Marianne died, and that on the morning of the Duke's departure from the Hall in February, 3 months before the London season began, he had entered the study at first light and simply turned the frame to the wall without explanation, which was the kind of thing that happens when a man has held something so long that the holding becomes an obscenity to him, and he cannot stop holding it. Marianne had been 22. She had been 7 months with child when he left for London on estate business, and when the message came from the Wiltshire house 9 days later, it had come to the wrong address, forwarded twice, and reached him on a Thursday afternoon when she had already been buried 2 days. He had not been there. He had been in London attending to the price of agricultural leases, and his wife had died without him. And the child had died with her. And that was the shape of the wound. He had not meant to tell Cecily any of this. He told her none of it directly. The portrait had been turning for weeks before he came to London, and something in the way she held precision as a form of respect made it difficult to maintain the wall he had built very carefully. In the 3 years since, against the knowledge that he was still capable of the specific attention that watching a person across a room requires. The season progressed. He did not speak of Marianne. He came to the library. He taught Thomas to play draughts. He left in the evenings for the engagements Lady Honoria scheduled for him, and Miss Vane smiled at him over dinner tables, and Cecily altered the ivory gown again and sat below the salt, and told herself the library mornings were simply what they were, a convenient arrangement, nothing else, and the arrangement did not mean anything. In this she was wrong, and she knew she was wrong, and the knowing sat in her chest like a hand pressed against old bruise. It was at the Hartley dinner, at the end of May, that the third stone of the walkway was laid. Thomas had been brought down to dine with the adults, an unusual concession that Lord Morpeth had allowed on the grounds that the evening was informal, and the Duke had asked. He sat between Cecily and a quiet young clergyman, and he ate his mutton with the focused application of a child who understands the privilege of the occasion, and when Lady Honoria said, from her end of the table, "Lord Morpeth, what an interesting experiment, allowing the boy at table. Children of charitable circumstance can be so unpredictable." The clergyman's fork paused, and Lord Morpeth's face registered the small flinch of a man caught between two social obligations, and Thomas sat very still. Cecily set down her glass. "Thomas is an admirable dinner companion," she said. Her voice was level. She had practiced level with great care. "He has excellent manners and a strong interest in natural history, which I find more than can be said for a great many adults at table. I am sure Lady Honoria did not intend to suggest otherwise." The table stilled. Lady Honoria's fan paused in its arc. Her eyes moved to Cecily with an expression of mild astonishment at the specific species of impertinence. "I am sure I did not," she said, very carefully. Thomas ate his mutton. He did not look at Cecily, and under the table, very quietly, his foot touched the side of her shoe, and stayed there for one small moment. And she thought, he would remember this. Whatever else happens, he will remember that someone did not let it stand. The Duke of Ashwick had heard every word. She knew this because when she looked up from her plate, because one must look up eventually, the table requires it, and he was looking at her from across the table with an expression so different from his customary stillness that she could not for a moment organize what she was seeing. It was not admiration, precisely. It was the face of a man who has been waiting to see a thing he suspected was possible, and has now seen it, and has no further doubt. He looked away before she did. She was the one who looked away last, which was unlike her, and which she did not examine. There was an evening in the first week of June when the season's social machinery ran late, and Lord Morpeth's house was quiet, and Cecily sat in the library past the hour she should have, reading by the last of a candle with her father's botanical volume at her elbow, and the Duke came in. He had attended something at Belgrave House and come back late, and the house was dark, and she heard him on the stairs, and then the library door opened, and he stopped when he saw her. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I did not think anyone was here." "I will go," she said, reaching for the botanical volume. "No." He said it with a quiet authority that was not a command, or was a command. She was never able to determine the difference with him. He crossed the room and sat in the chair he always used, the chair at the head of the table, and she stayed where she was with the botanical volume in her hands and the candle burning low. A silence of some length. Then he said, "My wife died 3 years ago." Cecily's hand stilled on the book. I was in London. There was business I thought could not wait. He was looking at the window. The streets below were quiet. She had sent word that she was unwell. I had arranged for the physician to attend her. I told myself the arrangement was sufficient. A pause. It was not sufficient. She did not speak. She understood, with a precision that came from having lost her own father, that what was wanted here was not comfort so much as a witness. Someone who would hear it without trying to fix the shape of it. Her name was Marianne, he said. She was 22 years old. The candle burned between them. I am sorry, she said. And she meant it in all the ways she had learned to mean it, the ways that do not reduce the thing to a ceremony. He looked at her then. Not across a dinner table. 3 feet away in the dark library, and his face was not the face he kept for the season, not the face of the richest duke in England who registered nothing and yielded nothing. It was simply the face of a man who had been carrying a particular weight for 3 years and who had told, just now, one person who would not use it against him. There is a portrait, he said. At the hall. I turned it to the wall in February, and I have not been able to account for why I did it, when I did it. She looked at the botanical volume in her hands. Her father's pressed viola was between pages 41 and 42, where it had always been. She said, "My father used to say that the body knows when something is finished, even when the mind is not ready to accept it." A long quiet. "Yes," the Duke said. "That is probably it." He sat for a while longer, not speaking, and then he said, "Go to sleep, Miss Hartwell," which was very much the form his concern took, the short declarative sentence that functioned as a command because it was the only vocabulary he had for it. She went. She lay awake until the house was fully dark, and she could hear nothing. And she placed her hand on the cover of the botanical volume. This was dangerous. Not the situation. Not the proximity. The specific feeling of being treated as someone whose perception is reliable. That was the dangerous thing. 3 days later, Lady Honoria summoned the Duke to Belgrave House. Cecily did not witness the meeting. She learned of it through Arabella, who had it through Lord Morpeth, who had it through the Duke's own solicitor, by a route that was not quite accidental. Lady Honoria had made clear her intentions. The season was 3 weeks from its close. Miss Vane's father, a man of considerable fortune and careful connections, was prepared to wait for a proposal until the end of June, but not beyond. Lady Honoria had scheduled a supper at the end of the month. Lord and Lady Morpeth invited Lord and Lady Stanhope if they would make the journey from Yorkshire, and a small gathered company of 30, at which the engagement was to be formally announced. The Duke, Arabella said, had said neither yes nor no. Arabella also told her, with the particular care of a sister who loves incompletely, that Lady Honoria had said in passing that it would be best if Cecily were not given reason to make herself inconvenient before the end of the season, and that Arabella had replied, quite correctly, that Cecily was never inconvenient. What Arabella did not say, and what Cecily read very clearly in the careful arrangement of her sister's face, was that Arabella believed the engagement would happen, and believed, further, that Cecily had been foolish to allow herself to feel whatever it was that anyone with eyes could see. She felt. "The Hartwell spinster," a voice behind her said. She was in the hall. She was putting on her bonnet. Lady Honoria's voice carried from the drawing-room where she had come to call, and her words were addressed to Mrs. Caldwell, with whom she had continued her collecting, and they had the particular lightness of someone who does not consider they can be overheard. It is really the most persistent arrangement. Arabella ought to find her a position before the season closes. The girl is decorative in her way, but there is no future in it. The Duke requires someone suitable, someone appropriate to his station. Not a charity case, and not— the pause was precisely calibrated— the Hartwell spinster. Cecily's hands finished tying the bonnet. She tied it with absolute steadiness, because she was practiced, and she walked out of the front door and down the steps and stood on the pavement in the May afternoon with her hands at her sides and the botanical volume in her reticule. This was the shape of the rest of it. This is what the rest of it will be. Another 10 years of this, 30 dinners a season, below the salt, useful, steady, and in the way. She walked to the post office. She sent another letter to Sir Reginald. This one was more specific about the nature of the position she was prepared to accept. She came back to the house and went upstairs and did not cry. Not then, and she did not sleep well that night. And she was in the library the next morning, because where else would she go? And Thomas came in at 9 and said, "You look tired," with the unsparing accuracy of a 7-year-old. "I am quite well," she said. "He looks tired too," Thomas said. She did not ask who. "If you are still listening, I want to say." She had asked nothing. She had not placed herself anywhere he did not already find her. What she had done was simply refuse to become less than she was, because less would have been easier for everyone. Hold on to that. The evening is not quite over. Lady Honoria's supper was the 30th of June. The invitation came to Arabella 2 weeks before, and carried with it the machinery of a completed plan, the way an announcement differs from a question. Dorothea came from Yorkshire with Lord Stanhope. Lord Morpeth arranged the carriages. Arabella had the ivory gown pressed and altered for the last time, and laid it out without comment. And Cecily put it on and stood in front of the glass for a moment. She had been wearing this gown to the wrong dinners for 3 years, and tonight will be no different. She was wrong about that. Lady Honoria's dining room was half the size of Morpeth House's and twice as deliberate in its arrangements. The flowers were specifically selected. The seating placed Miss Vane at the Duke's right and Lady Honoria at his left, and Cecily found herself near the foot of the table once more, between Dorothea and Lord Stanhope, which was at least familiar company. Dorothea's hand found hers under the table when they sat, which was not like Dorothea, who was not demonstrative. And Cecily looked at her sister's face, and saw that Dorothea had been told something she did not want to be here to witness. The dinner began. The soup was consumed. The conversation flowed. The Duke ate. He was impeccably present, impeccably formal, and he had not looked at Cecily once. She had expected this. She had prepared for this. She ate the soup and ate the fish that followed, and listened to Lord Stanhope describe his Yorkshire acreage with the same composed attention she had applied to 3 years of dinners, and she did not look at the Duke, and the candles burned, and Lady Honoria's smile settled over the room like a judgment already handed down. At the interval between the 4th and 5th courses, Lady Honoria set down her glass. "I believe we are all friends here," she said, "and I hope I may say, as friends, that the matter of which many of us have been aware is now happily resolved. My nephew has given me leave to announce that a very suitable connection has been formed, and that we may anticipate an engagement between His Grace the Duke of Ashwick and Miss Vane to be formalized upon the close of the season." The room murmured its pleasure. A warm sound, practiced, the sound a room makes when a plan concludes. Cecily placed her hands in her lap and looked at the tablecloth. The Duke had not moved. Across the table, Dorothea's hand found the edge of Cecily's sleeve. Cecily thought, with the precision of someone who has very little left to hold. Stand up. Stand up and thank Lady Honoria for a lovely evening and leave. Leave now. Do not let this be the moment you are seen crying at a dinner table. Leave while you still have every piece of yourself. She placed her hands on the table to rise. The Duke of Ashwick pushed back his chair. The sound of it reached every corner of the room, and the room was suddenly, entirely still. He stood. He was a tall man, and the room was not large. And when he stood, he occupied it in a way that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with the specific authority of a decision made past the point of revision. He looked at Lady Honoria for one moment, a look that was not angry, not combative, simply final. And then he crossed the room, 30 feet, past the length of the table, past the faces of Lord Morpeth and Lord Stanhope, and Arabella and Dorothea, past Miss Vane, who had gone very still in her chair. He stopped beside Cecily. She had not risen. Her hands were still on the table. She was looking up at him with the expression of a person who is prepared for many outcomes, and not this one. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he went down on one knee. The room did not breathe. He was 35 years old, and he was the wealthiest man in England, and he was on one knee on Lady Honoria's dining room floor. And he looked at Cecily Hartwell with the face she had seen in the library in the dark. Not the face of the season. Not the face of the man who yielded nothing, but the face underneath that, the one she had come to know in the mornings with the common Swift and the pressed viola and her father's penciled notes in the margins. Cecily, he said, her first name, in his voice, before 30 witnesses. I'm asking you, not anyone else. A silence of a kind that is not empty but full, so full it has a quality like weight, like the moment before rain. She looked at his face. She looked at the man who had said her father's precision was a form of respect, and who had told her about Marianne in the dark, and who had turned the portrait to the wall in February when his body knew what his mind was not yet ready to accept. Yes, she said. Her voice did not waver. He took her hand and held it, and remained there a moment as though what was required was not haste, but ceremony, as though the moment was worth the full weight of itself. When he rose, the room came back to life in small sounds, exhaled breath, and the small percussion of a glass set down. Lady Honoria sat with her fan open and her face perfectly composed, and her eyes carrying an expression Cecily had not seen on them before, something that was not quite defeat and was not quite recognition, but lived in the territory between the two, the expression of someone who has for the first time encountered the edge of their own certainty. Miss Vane was looking at her hands. She was 19 years old, and she had been told all her life that she was the correct choice for every room she entered. And the machine had, for the first time, produced a different answer. Cecily did not look at her with anything like triumph. She was the product of the machine's cruelty in her own way, and whatever was wrong with the evening had been wrong from the beginning. Lord Morpeth, who had sat at the end of the table with the expression of a man watching a weather event he had not predicted, said very quietly, "Well." It was the only thing that needed to be said, and it served as the procedural confirmation of the event, a man of sufficient standing having witnessed and named it. Dorothea's hand found Cecily's arm and held it for one moment, warm and brief, and Cecily felt the years of Yorkshire letters and the distance and the insufficiency of sisters who love imperfectly and nevertheless love, and she pressed back. The carriages came at 11. The night was warm. Cecily and the Duke stood together on the pavement, while the others arranged themselves into their various conveyances, and she held the botanical volume in her hands, because she always had it, and he stood beside her in the particular way he had, which was close enough to be felt, and formal enough to be correct, and entirely unlike the distance of a stranger. "You sent a letter to Hartwell," he said. She looked at him. You knew about that? Morpeth told me. He was concerned. A pause, not long. I was not pleased. She thought about that for a moment. She thought about the specific quality of not being pleased, and what it implied about the month that had preceded it. I thought, she said carefully, that the situation was clear. It was not clear to me, he said. I was not ready for it to be clear. The carriage appeared. He handed her in, and she sat with the botanical volume in her lap and the window open to the warm night. And when the carriage moved, she looked out at the street and felt the shape of the evening settling around her, like something she had not expected to own, and was now, irrevocably, required to carry. She was not afraid of it. She was afraid she would wake up and the weight of it would not be there. She did not wake up. The weight remained. The Duke's estate in Wiltshire was called Ashwick Hall, and it lay 20 miles from the village where her father had been born, a fact she learned in the first week of their engagement, and which struck her with the specific significance of a thing that could not have been planned, but that the world had arranged all the same. The Hall's park ran to the edge of old farmland, and the farmland to the edge of a wood where the common swift returned every summer to nest in the stone barn at the wood's edge. And Thomas, who came to the Hall in late July with the settled confidence of a child who has been told his situation is permanent, spent the first afternoon of his arrival lying on his back in the long grass below the barn, watching them. On the first evening at the Hall, the Duke took Cecily to the study. The portrait of Marianne was there, on the wall behind the desk, facing outward. He had had it turned before they arrived. Cecily stood before it and looked at it for a long moment. She was 22 in it, with dark hair and a direct, rather intelligent gaze. And something in her expression carried the quality of a person about to say something important. She was kind, the Duke said behind her. She deserved better than what happened. Yes, Cecily said. I do not want to keep that from you. The fact of her. The fact of what I failed. She turned to face him. He was standing at the door with his hands at his sides, and the look of a man who has said the most honest thing he knows how to say, and is waiting to see what is made of it. She thought of her father's pressed viola, the longer stem he had noted in pencil. She thought of precision as a form of respect. She was a part of your life, she said. I would not want you to keep her from me. He crossed the room. He did not touch her face the way a man in a story might. He took her hands, both of them, and held them in the specific way he had of holding a thing carefully. And he looked at her with the look she had come to know above all others, the look from the library in the dark, and said, Cecily. Just her name, her given name, which was also the first thing he had ever given her, the night of the supper, before 30 witnesses. She had kept the botanical volume in her traveling case through the journey north and unpacked it that evening and set it on the writing table in the room that was now hers, and her father's penciled notes were still in the margins, and the pressed viola was still between pages 41 and 42, and the study fire was lit against the July evening's chill, and outside the window the park ran dark and soft to the edge of the old farmland, and somewhere in the stone barn at the wood's edge, the Swifts were still, for once, at rest. She had been seen, not managed, not endured, not placed below the salt and permitted to be useful. She had been, at last, and entirely, seen. Thank you for staying to the very end. If Cecily's story moved you, leave a word below. I read everyone.